Home Depot just told Wall Street that shopping trips fell 1%, even while total sales climbed 5.7%. Fewer people are walking through the door, but the ones who do show up are spending more per visit. If you've searched something like, "Is the U.S. consumer broke?" or pulled up the Home Depot sales report for 2026, that gap is exactly what triggered the headlines. But here's the number nobody puts in the same sentence. If you're 62 and sitting on something close to a $500,000 portfolio, the part of the market tied to spending at places like Home Depot could cost you real money. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you stopped buying the $10 piece of lumber or decided the $2,500 fridge felt like a downgrade from the one you bought back in 2005. You're not broke. You're on strike, and that's a completely rational response to prices that don't feel like they match what you're getting. But most financial advice tells people your age to just own the haystack, hold the S&P 500, and ignore the noise. That advice skips one thing. If you're close to retirement and the consumer pulls back at the same time the market dips, you can get hit with something called sequence of returns risk. That's the version of bad timing where you're forced to sell stocks at a 20% discount just to cover your property tax bill because the drop happened in the exact years you couldn't afford to wait it out. So this isn't really a story about lumber prices or a slow trip to Home Depot. It's about what happens to your retirement number when millions of people your age quietly do the same thing you're doing. If you're tired of advice that ignores what it's actually like to be 60 in this economy, subscribe to Wes Investor. We focus on the math keeps you in your home, not the math that sounds good on a slide. Home Depot's own numbers to story. Comparable transactions fell 1% this quarter, and the company pointed to something specific, a deferral of big-ticket projects like kitchen remodels. People aren't skipping the store because they're broke. They're skipping the expensive stuff on purpose. Ask yourself honestly, how many projects you've put off this year? Not because you couldn't manage the payment, but because the price tag felt insulting. There's a name for what you're feeling when you fix the old stove instead of replacing it. Call it the buyer's rebellion. You're not a victim of the economy here. You're a conscious consumer making a deliberate choice, and that choice feels good. It should, but there's a catch nobody explains to you at the register. The S&P 500 is top-heavy, and a chunk of it depends on people spending money at stores like Home Depot, Lowe's, and Target. When you and everyone your age quietly stop buying, you're not just sticking it to the man. You're chipping away at the growth and dividends your own retirement plan is counting on. That's the trade-off nobody puts on the price tag. The same spending you're avoiding to protect your monthly budget is partly what keeps your 401k growing. Here's the mini-math. Say you're holding a $500,000 portfolio, and consumer discretionary stocks make up roughly 10% of the S&P 500. If that slice drops 15%, because enough people go on this kind of spending strike, you've lost about $7,500 in paper wealth. Compare that to the $500 you saved fixing your own toilet instead of calling a plumber. The math isn't close. None of this means you owe anyone your spending to prop up a quarterly earnings report. That's not the takeaway here. The takeaway is that your grocery bill and your retirement account are more connected than they look on a statement, and ignoring that connection doesn't protect you from either one. Meanwhile, the income side of your budget isn't keeping pace either. The 2026 Social Security cost of living adjustment landed at 2.8%. That's real money, But the price of hiring a plumber or an electrician has climbed faster than that for years now. So your check goes up a little, and the cost of the work you're avoiding goes up more. I've watched people put off the exact same repair for 2 or 3 years running, telling themselves it's not urgent yet. That gap between what your income gives you and what labor actually costs is where the real danger lives. Not in a lower stock price, in the one bill Social Security was never built to keep up with, and it's sitting inside your own walls right now. Instead of a blanket boycott, there's a simpler way to sort every dollar you're tempted to spend or avoid at a place like Home Depot. Call it the Retiree Rebellion filter, and it splits spending into 3 buckets. Once you know which bucket a purchase belongs in, the guilt mostly disappears, because you're not guessing anymore. The first is the preservation bucket. That's anything that stops your home from decaying: a leaking toilet, a cracked window seal, a roof that's already showing its age. Skip these and the cost doesn't disappear. It just sits there and grows quietly in the background, usually behind a wall or under a floor where you can't see it happening. The second is the efficiency bucket. These are upgrades that lower your fixed costs going forward: a more efficient water heater, better attic insulation, an appliance that actually uses less power than the one it's replacing. You're not spending to feel better, you're spending to shrink next year's bills. A $1,200 heat pump water heater that trims $15 off your monthly bill still pays for itself over time, even if the sticker price stings on the way out the door. The third is the protest bucket. This is where you're allowed to cut back purely because you don't want to fund somebody else's margin. Skipping the $40 designer paint roller for the $12 one. Buying the generic version instead of the name brand fastener. Nobody needs this money to protect their home, so cut it freely and stop feeling like you owe anyone an explanation for it. Ask yourself which bucket your last 3 trips to a hardware store actually fell into. Most people find at least one purchase they labeled protest that was really preservation wearing a disguise. I used to tell people to always buy the best, because it meant fewer repairs down the road. I was wrong about that, or at least the world changed underneath the advice. In 2026, the best version of most appliances comes with a computer chip that quietly fails in 3 years, sometimes sooner. So now I lean toward repair first, but only when the math actually backs it up, not out of stubbornness. Here's what that math looks like in practice. Say your fridge is 15 years old and the repair quote comes back at $300. A brand new one runs $2,500. If you skip the repair and buy new, that $2,500 could have sat in a money market account earning 4.5%, which comes out to roughly $112 a year in interest you're giving up instead. Your old fridge only has to survive 3 more years for the repair to come out ahead. Most 15-year-old fridges can do that without much drama. None of the 3 buckets is inherently better than the others. A dollar in the protest bucket is just as legitimate as a dollar in the preservation bucket, as long as you're honest with yourself about which one you're actually spending. This filter isn't about being cheap, and it isn't about being a martyr either. It's about knowing which dollar is protecting your house and which one is just protecting your ego. Once you can tell the difference, the whole store stops feeling like a minefield. But here's the part that gets uncomfortable. What happens when the rebellion isn't really a choice anymore? What if your fixed income is being quietly eaten by a cost that never shows up in a Home Depot earnings report? That's the question worth sitting with. Before you decide your next trip to the store was ever really about lumber prices. Compare this moment to 2008. Back then, people stopped spending because their home equity had actually vanished, wiped out almost overnight. That's not what's happening now. Most people your age are sitting on record home equity. The house is worth more than it's ever been. And yet you feel cash poor, like the money exists on paper, but never makes it into your checking account. Here's why. Healthcare research from AHRQ shows the average household 65 and older spends more than $7,000 a year out of pocket on medical costs. And that's before premiums enter the picture. Layer on the 2026 Medicare Part B premium of $202.90 a month, and you're looking at close to $2,435 a year for that one line item alone, before a single doctor visit or prescription gets billed. Think about the raise you actually got this year. The 2026 Social Security Cost of Living Adjustment lifted most checks by 2.8%. That sounds like progress, until you notice your Part B premium and your out-of-pocket healthcare costs climbed faster than that. You didn't fall behind because you spent carelessly. You fell behind because the two bills that grow the fastest in your budget aren't the ones you can shop around for. Add those numbers together, and the picture gets clearer. What used to be your discretionary money, the cash you'd have used for a kitchen remodel or a new patio, has quietly been reclassified. It didn't disappear. It moved into a column labeled healthcare, and it's not moving back. None of this shows up as one alarming number on a monthly statement. It shows up as a slow squeeze, the kind that's easy to blame on your own spending habits, instead of on the two categories actually driving it. So when someone says the Home Depot shopper is broke, that's not quite right. You're not broke. Your fixed costs simply absorbed the category of spending that used to feel optional. Your fun money didn't shrink because you got worse with money. It shrank because two other lines on your budget got bigger without asking your permission first. Meet a couple I'll call Jim and Sarah, age 63, watching every price at Home Depot like everyone else their age right now. Sarah noticed a small roof leak 18 months ago, just a faint water stain in the hallway ceiling. Jim figured a quote from a roofer would come back inflated, so they decided to keep an eye on it themselves instead of calling anyone. Here's the unprepared version of that story. 2 years pass. That faint stain turns into soft, spongy decking under the shingles, because water doesn't wait for you to feel ready. What could have been a $500 patch job becomes a full $22,000 roof replacement. And because this happens during a stretch where the market is pulling back, the exact kind of dip that follows a consumer pullback, they're forced to sell S&P 500 shares at the bottom just to cover it. They don't just pay $22,000. They pay $22,000 plus the growth those shares would have delivered if they'd never had to sell in a down year. It's easy to hear this story and think it's about home maintenance. It's really about timing. The same $500 decision, made 2 years apart, produces two completely different outcomes for a portfolio, not because the roof changed, but because the market's mood changed underneath it. It's tempting to feel foolish looking back at a decision like that. Try not to. 18 months earlier, calling a roofer felt like an unnecessary expense, and that instinct wasn't crazy, it was just incomplete. Now here's the version where the retiree rebellion filter actually gets used. The same couple notices the same stain, but this time they sort it correctly. A roof leak isn't a protest purchase, it's preservation, full stop. Instead of pushing an extra $1,100 in catch-up contributions into their IRA that year, they redirect that cash toward the repair immediately while it's still a $500 fix instead of a five-figure disaster. Their long-term stock positions never get touched. No forced selling, no locking in a loss at the worst possible moment. Same couple, same roof, same starting point. One version costs them $22,000 and a chunk of their portfolio growth. The other costs $500 and a slightly smaller IRA contribution that year. That's not a subtle difference. That's the entire ballgame. The gap between those two versions is rarely about willpower. It's about having a system that tells you which bucket a leak belongs in before the leak makes the decision for you. Jim and Sarah protected their retirement by spending money at the right time, on the right bucket. But what happens when you look at your own accounts and realize there's nothing left in the cash bucket to spend at all? There's a name for what a lot of people your age are feeling right now, something researchers call frugality fatigue. You spent decades training yourself to hunt for the better deal, compare unit prices, wait for the sale. Now the deals feel like they've disappeared, and what's left underneath that is a kind of loss aversion. Not just about money, but about control. You're not only trying to save a few dollars, you're trying to prove to yourself that you still have a say in what things cost you. It's normal to feel a flash of anger when a piece of lumber costs 3 times what it did 5 years ago. That's not you being cheap. That's a rational reaction to prices that moved faster than your income did. Nobody needs to talk you out of that feeling. This isn't unique to hardware stores either. The same instinct shows up at the grocery store, the pharmacy counter, the gas pump. Anywhere the price moved without your permission, some part of you goes looking for a way to win the moment back. Here's a small shift that changes how the whole thing lands emotionally. Instead of telling yourself, "I can't afford this," try telling yourself, "I am choosing not to fund this company's margin right now." Same decision, same dollar amount, but one version makes you feel like a victim of the economy, and the other makes you feel like someone making a deliberate call. That shift alone takes a lot of the shame out of walking past something you want, but don't need. I spent close to 45 minutes in a plumbing aisle last week, comparing a $12 flapper valve against a $30 Pro Kit for a toilet that had been running for a year. If I'm honest, I wasn't really trying to save $18. I was trying to prove to myself that I wasn't a sucker for grabbing the more expensive one without checking. Most people your age know exactly what that feeling is like, even if the specific object changes from person to person. That instinct isn't a flaw. It's the same instinct that got you this far financially in the first place. The trick isn't shutting it off. It's pointing it at the right target so it protects your future instead of just protecting your pride in the checkout line. Give it a real job to do, and it stops fighting you at the register. So what does Home Depot's report actually tell you? Not that the economy is collapsing back to the 1930s. It tells you that people your age are on a kind of quiet strike, spending less on the stuff that feels optional and more carefully on the stuff that doesn't. That's not weakness. That's discipline finally showing up in the data. The way you protect yourself through this isn't a blanket boycott, and it isn't blind spending either. It's knowing the difference between protest spending, the stuff you're skipping just because you don't want to fund someone else's margin, and preservation spending, the stuff that quietly gets more expensive every year you put it off. That distinction matters more this year than it did 5 years ago, simply because the gap between necessary and optional has gotten so much wider. One more piece worth using while you sort through this. If you're 65 or older, the senior deduction from the One Big Beautiful Bill Act gives you an extra $6,000 off your taxable income $12,000 if you're married and both of you qualify. That's real money that can help offset exactly the kind of repair or upgrade costs we've been talking about, and a lot of people simply forget to claim it. None of this requires you to feel bad about a slow trip to the hardware store, or guilty about the $2 you saved on a paint roller. It just requires you to know which bucket that dollar belongs in. If you want to navigate the 2026 economy without losing your dignity or your portfolio, hit subscribe. We're building a retirement plan that works for people living on Main Street, not just people watching Wall Street from a distance.